Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Lives of the Past. Today our journey is going to take us to Denton Cemetery, located in Belleville, Michigan, right at the city line with Ypsilanti, Michigan. The cemetery itself is unremarkable and sits on approximately 3 to 4 acres of land. After several weeks of research, I could only find 3 individuals that were somewhat historical. So today we'll be looking at the gravesite of Donald Dolgenbach, Leon Burnell. But first, we will be delving into the mystery surrounding Janie Louise Mixer and what she has to do with this cemetery. So walk with me today as we visit Denton Cemetery and we explore the lives of the past of those who have been laid to rest here. To understand who Janie Louise Mixer was, you have to understand who John Norman Collins was. For 2 years, from 1967 to 1969, female co-eds in the Ann Arbor, Michigan area were terrorized by someone who was killing them. During this time, police theorized that John Norman Collins was the person behind the killings. Police believe that he killed 7 co-eds, but he may be also responsible for an additional 33 deaths. On March 20th, 1969, Jane was trying to find a ride home to Muskegon, Michigan, where she wanted to visit her parents. During police interviews, it was brought to light that she had placed a notice on a bulletin board stating that she needed a ride. Later on, somebody also stated that Jane had taken a ride with a stranger that nobody knew. The day after Jane reportedly took that ride with the stranger, she was found dead. And guess where? Denton Cemetery. That's why we're talking about Jane and Denton Cemetery, even though Jane is not buried here. On the morning that Jane was found, one of the neighbors was walking the area and noticed the body in the cemetery and immediately called police. Jane's body was found inside one of the entrances, laying on a pillow with her face covered. Jane's shoes were off her feet and her dress was pulled up above her waist. Her face was also covered with a jacket. Whoever put Jane there also laid her on a pillow, which looks to me by the photographs to be a pillow on the back of a couch. That shows some type of compassion, something John Norman Collins never showed one of his victims. You see, John Norman Collins strangled his victims, stabbed his victims, mutilated his victims, and then threw them out like garbage along the road. And that's not the case what happened here. And there's no arguing that Jane's murder wasn't brutal, but compared to how John Norman Collins disposed of his victims, Jane's body was disposed of with much more compassion. Now, when the Ann Arbor cops found out about Jane's death, they immediately jumped to the conclusion John Norman Collins was the murderer. And they held on to that assumption all the way up to and beyond the year 2000. Sometime after the year 2000, Michigan State Police started a new investigation unit for cold cases. And one of the first cases they brought to light was Janie Mixer. Now, there was DNA from 1969 that the police did save. When the DNA was studied and tested, guess what? They found out it did not match John Norman Collins. In fact, it actually matched 2 people. So the 2 people that the DNA matched was one, a Gary Lederman, and his DNA matched her pantyhose. And the second DNA that was pulled off was from a drop of blood, and that matched a John Roulis. Now, I'm probably pronouncing those names wrong, but you can always look it up online and see. In 2001, Gary Lederman was arrested and charged and convicted for writing false prescriptions. Michigan's new law compelled first-time felons to give DNA samples. Having nothing to hide, not being a convicted felon yet at this time, he volunteered to give the sample. That DNA sample would come back to haunt him in 2004. In August 2002, John Roulis was convicted of the murder, the second-degree murder of his mother. He was also compelled by the same state law to give samples of his blood for DNA testing. That blood sample would also become a match in the 1969 murder of Janie Mixer. The only problem was with Janie Louise was only 4 at the time of her death. Gary Lederman maintained his innocence until he died in 2019 in prison. From the reports that I read, both Lederman and Louise's blood was being tested in the same lab the same day, but by different technicians, working on 2 different cases, but yet the DNA results come back to one case that's 35 years old, and both of those individuals show up in a 35-year-old case, even though one is only 4 years old. How in the world did they match blood to a 4-year-old 35 years earlier? It doesn't make sense. Now, I'm not saying that Gary Lederman is not guilty, but what I am saying, one, if not both of those samples were contaminated in that lab that day. The technicians testified that they did not go near each other, and so there was no way they could have cross-contaminated the blood. The fact alone that a 4-year-old's blood came up in a blood test from 35 years ago, what's that got to be? That's astronomical, 1 billion to 1. That test that those technicians did should have been thrown out. Janie Mixer was laid to rest in Restlawn Cemetery in Muskegon, Michigan. And our next stop takes us to the grave of Donald James Daltonball. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. On August 6, 1987, he was a rookie firefighter who worked part-time for both the fire departments in Romulus and Taylor, Michigan. He also drove ambulance. On that fateful day, Northwest Airlines Flight 255 crashed on takeoff from Detroit Airport, killing 156 people. Out of all the passengers, there was one survivor, a 4-year-old child. Daltonball was the one who rescued her from the crash. A little over 3.5 years later, he passed away at the age of 25 from having a blood clot in his heart after fighting a house fire. He was just 25 years old. Alright, and my last stop for today is to the gravesite of Leon Burrell, who back in 1940 was an alternative delegate to the 1940 Republican Convention. That's it for today's visit to Denton Cemetery, located in Belleville, Michigan. If you like what I do here, please consider subscribing, leaving me a thumbs up and a comment.